Hey there, welcome back to Brad's Labs. Today we're going to be going back to the Han Dynasty. This was requested by Sarah. But before we get into any of that, I wanted to take and say, hey, we're up over 50 subscribers now. I know that's not a monumental achievement, but it is for me. So as always, before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of the time travel, we need to talk about what Sarah wanted. She wanted to go back to the Han Dynasty, but she didn't have a particular time period that she wanted to go back to or a particular date. So I got to choose that one. So that brings us to what I chose. I chose to go back to 9 CE for her. The only things that she asked was that she was 30 years old and she was a female. Before we send Sarah back in time, there's something that I want to take and bring up. We need to keep an open mind when we're traveling through time. Just because our culture views things one way doesn't mean another culture views things the same way. Especially as you go back in time. Things were radically different. We have made a lot of progress. We still got a long way to come on a lot of issues. But one of the things that they stressed when I was doing all my studying was you need to keep an open mind. You can't judge other cultures on your culture. Let's get down to business and get all the nasty little facts out of the way before we get to the story. The Han Dynasty is considered the second great imperial dynasty of China. It was founded in 206 BCE and ended in 220 CE. Quite a long time there. It was founded by Liu Bang, and he overthrew the Qin dynasty. But when he overthrew them, he actually kept most of the governing bodies the same. What he did do was he added administrative areas around the country, and this helped take and consolidate power and make governance a little bit easier. But it also led to a lot of other issues with the governance that we will see shortly. Even though they kept most of the government the same, one of the major things that they did change was the adoption of Confucian ideals. Confucian ideals teach moderation, virtue, and duty to family. And the problem is that these really only covered up their authoritarian practices that they were doing with the government. But we did get a lot of amazing new advances in technology, and things we still use to this day. We got the rudder for a ship, so the only thing that helps the ship steer. We got an adjustable wrench, so like a monkey wrench. We got the wheelbarrow. And probably you're using it right now, paper. It gave us the ability to have cash money that we don't really use much anymore. Paper to write on that we don't really use much anymore. So it's not as important now, but it was. Now that we have all the boring facts out of the way, let's get into Sarah's life. Sarah hops into the time machine. She's rocketed back to 9 CE. She's 30 years old, so that means that she was born in 21 BCE. She was born to a family of nobles, and they had very high political ambition, and they wanted to keep their political power that they did have. So what do? Well, you marry your children off to other families that have political power and can help advance you. So Sarah's marriage would have been arranged from when she was fairly young. Now, I'm not saying that she was married off as a child. There were actually laws put into place that prevented people from marrying their children off at too young. So Sarah would have been around 16 when she actually was able to get married. Up until Sarah was able to get married, she would have spent her time studying how to be the best wife she could possibly be. There wasn't too many expectations of wives. They were only really expected to obey their husband and to produce a male heir for them. Her family, when looking to marry Sarah off, would have looked for two things. One, who could advance them politically, and two, who could actually financially afford to purchase Sarah. That was the way that marriages were arranged, and there was actually an incentive for Sarah's family to marry her off as soon as possible. They had a tax that was put on to unmarried women, and the family had to pay that tax, so marrying her off was a necessity. Sarah's husband is found, and it's in a family that does have pretty high political connections, but not high enough for Sarah's family. But they're going to go ahead and take the marriage anyway because, it's the best they can get for their daughter. At this time, if you were part of the royal family, part of the emperor's family, you didn't have anything to worry about. Everybody else below them had a lot to worry about, and there was a lot of conspiring and trying to take and get other families knocked out so you could take their place. And that was just the way that it was done, and it actually led to a lot of issues later on down the road. The year is now 5 BCE, Sarah's 16, and she's married off into her new family. I say new family because she would have been adopted into their family, and her husband is 26. This actually follows the Confucian teachings of a 10-year age gap between the husband and the wife. However, it doesn't follow it to a point, because the Confucian teachings actually state that the wife should be 20 and the husband should be 30. So they didn't marry them off a little bit early, but it was generally accepted that that was okay. Now that Sarah is married, her only real purpose is to make a male heir for her husband. If she does this, her husband's family is going to treat her a whole lot better. Unfortunately, Sarah doesn't manage to do this. She only manages to produce daughters. It's no fault of hers, it's actually his, but they don't know that stuff yet. This means that her husband starts to bring in concubines. And yes, that is plural, concubines, because he would actually bring in as many as he could financially afford. And he would do this to produce a male heir. Now, the concubine was considered a servant and did not have the same rights as the wife, so they would have to actually live in a separate part of the house. Any child born of the concubine wouldn't have the same inheritance rights as an actual child, but when one wants a male heir, one is going to find a way to do it. Sarah cannot show any jealousy towards the concubine whatsoever. It was actually thought that any wives that showed jealousy towards their husband's concubines had a special place in hell awaiting them. Sarah's life would have been rather dull, and she didn't have a whole lot of freedoms inside the house. She was expected to stay to the inner chambers of the house, and her only real jobs inside the house were to teach the children and to keep track of the finances. So yes, that does mean that she would know exactly how much her husband was spending on the concubines. If her husband wanted a divorce, there was actually quite a few reasons why he could get a divorce. And here's a few of them. Although he could divorce his wife for just about anything, there was actually some reasons that he could not divorce her. One, it was actually frowned upon, so it was really rare. Two, if she had no family to be returned to, then he couldn't divorce her. Another reason is if she actually went through with the 3 years of mourning that was required for his dead parents, then he couldn't divorce her. But what could Sarah get a divorce for? If he was being disrespectful to her family. And even then, it was kind of a long shot. Even though Sarah wouldn't have much freedom and she wouldn't have had much autonomy over what was going on in her day-to-day life, she could still want political connections for her children and make them climb the ladder. So she could whisper into her husband's ear and try to convince him to make new political connections. And at this point in time, there was actually a family that was pretty high on the ladder, the Wong family. And they had actually been pretty close to the throne for quite a while, even before Sarah was born, but they weren't high enough yet. Sarah's husband decides he's going to tie himself to the Wong family. The Wong family was already on the climb, but one member had their eyes set just a little bit higher. Wang Mang had his eyes set on the throne itself. Problem is, it was already occupied by Ping Di. But on the 3rd of February, 6 CE, he was actually cut a lucky break when Ping Di died. But he was possibly poisoned by Wang Mang. They're not really for certain, nobody really knows. That's neither here nor there. But he was presented with another problem. He wasn't the heir to the throne. There was actually 50 heirs to choose from. And guess who got to choose the heir? If you guessed Wang Ming, then you guessed correctly. He actually got to choose the heir to the throne. And he was able to choose from over 50 people. He chose the youngest of those, which was born in 5 CE, so the child was only about a year old. So when the child was put on the throne, they weren't actually given the title of emperor, but young prince instead. And Wang Ming actually ruled in the place as a regent, basically. Now, even though Wang Ming was actually acting emperor, he wasn't emperor. So he needed Sarah's husband to help with one more thing. And that was to spread a rumor that the Han Dynasty had already ran its course, that it was finished. It was time for a new dynasty to rise up. And from this, they spread a rumor to help end the Han Dynasty. And they started the Qin Dynasty. The year is now 9 CE, and Wang Mang has actually declared himself the new emperor and has started the Qin Dynasty. Now, if you remember earlier, I said that the Han Dynasty was the second longest running dynasty, and it didn't end until 220, CE. Well, this is much like, that year that you swore off all sweets at New Year's, and then you spent 2 months eating nothing but sweets, but then didn't do it for the rest of the year, and at the end you still said, hey, I did a whole year without any sweets. This is basically what historians consider this to be. Now that Wang Mang was actually on the throne, Sarah and her husband actually needed to be pretty careful about the laws that they chose to follow and the laws they chose to break. And it was better off that they followed all the laws, because he was a stickler for laws. He actually executed 3 of his own sons, 1 grandson, and a nephew, all for breaking the law. Wang Mang actually instituted a whole bunch of new laws when he came into power, and they were quite unpopular with the upper class. He took and tried to equally distribute the land, and this made people that had large amounts of land angry. They didn't have to pay taxes, and the peasants did. He tried to give the peasants the land so that the peasants would pay taxes to help refill coffers. Another thing that he did was actually try to take and change the tax policies. This also made people with money quite angry because, as we know today, rich people don't like to pay their fair share of what they should. Unfortunately for Wang Ming, the policies he put in place weren't the only issues that presented itself during his reign. In 11 CE, the Huanghe River actually reversed course, and it did it a few times a couple years before. But this led to people being displaced, this led to famine, this led to diseases being spread, and ultimately it led to rebellion. People started grouping together, and there was even a group called themselves the Red Eyebrows. But in 23 CE, it all just kind of collapsed for him. All of the civil war, all the rebellions, came to a boiling point, and they actually managed to take and infiltrate the capital. Wang Ming and his followers did what they could. They used crossbows until they weren't able to actually defend themselves with crossbows anymore, and they picked up their swords. But eventually, the rebels actually managed to make it up to where they were fighting, and Wang Ming and the last followers that he had actually were killed. After it was all said and done, Sarah didn't have much control over her life. Her marriage was arranged. It was all chosen for her by her parents. When she got married, her husband would tell her what to do. She only had to be obedient and to give as many heirs to him as possible. And while doing this research, I kept thinking back to doing Megan's and thinking, wow, this is pretty bleak. And there was a saying that kept coming to mind. The grass is always greener on the other side. And, we often sit there and think of maybe life would be different if I was doing this. Problem is, history isn't clean. History is often dirty. It's disgusting, really, when you get down to it. We have come a long, long way. We still have a long way to come. So now that you're probably a little bit depressed like I am, I do want to sit there and say, I hope you guys do have a wonderful day. And I want you to think about, just how far things actually truly have come.